Hey everybody, we're back, and it's time now to think really carefully about Robert Dahl's 5 criteria for a good democracy. Again, I just want to stress that this is one potential definition of democracy that Dahl is working with, and I really challenge you to think about whether or not this squares with your understanding of what makes for a functioning democracy. Maybe you have more criteria than he does. Maybe you have fewer, but I think it's a good starting place for us to go from. So the first tenet, the first criterion that Robert Dahl is writing about is one called effective participation. I think this is an important criterion. There's a reason why it's the first one, essentially, because when Robert Dahl is talking about political participation, he's not just talking about the ability to cast a ballot. Okay, you can think about a situation in which everyone in a country is allowed to vote and allowed to vote. Often there's many elections. We've got an election every month, let's say. However, if you were to go to that polling place and you were to encounter somebody who would say, "Hi, welcome to the polling place. I'm here to record your vote." Who are you voting for? The incumbent who's been in power for 30 years and who we're all big fans of, or the challenger, right? Who, by the way, is very bad and has scary policies and you really don't want to vote for that person. What's it going to be? Let's record your vote. I'll check the box here, right? For you. You might imagine that in a scenario like that, it seems unlikely either that your vote's going to be recorded correctly by this person who's making that choice for you, right, on the paper, or let's say that maybe there's intimidation happening at that polling place where you go in there and there's some toughs, right, with billy clubs or whatever standing around, all with the buttons or something of the incumbent saying, who to make who would be the right choice here. There's all kinds of different tactics, essentially, that authoritarians use in a variety of different countries across the world to essentially try to intimidate people or to force people, or in many cases to compel them in other means to cast ballots, again, purportedly free, purportedly fair ballots for the incumbent and not challenger. This is a really serious problem in many, so-called democracies, sort of lapsed democracies, where, the basic criterion of having open elections is on the table, and yet somehow, through some way or another, it's very strange, the incumbent party always wins. It's very weird how that happens. Right? And so in some cases, this is just, bad actors cooking the books completely, right? There's some political science scholarship out there that shows that occasionally at the precinct level in corrupt countries like this, you'll see that the vote tallies that have been put in there, like written in there by, election officials, that is basically people who work for the ruling party, they tend to look like they're random numbers, but actually we as humans are bad at making up random numbers off the top of our heads. And so we tend to write the same kinds of numbers over and over. And so they've done some interesting studies showing that at the precinct level, the sort of so-called random numbers tend to pop up a lot more than they would if they were truly random, meaning that obviously somebody has been writing in these tallies instead of actually counting votes. Again, like there's intimidation, there's vote suppression, there's all kinds of different ways that authoritarians or sort of anti-democratic elements in different countries can prevent participation from being effective. So again, the idea is you can participate as much as you want, but if it's not effective, it doesn't actually go towards being fairly counted, if it doesn't go towards having some sort of meaningful impact on whether or not someone holds office, right? That's not really an exercise of power. That's a powerless use of participation because it does not affect who gets what, when, where, or why, right? Going back to our definition. A second criterion that we should definitely talk about is this idea of equality in voting. So Robert Dahl essentially makes the argument that democracies are not really democratic unless every adult in that society has their vote count the same amount, essentially, as all other adults in that society. We can argue over whether or not, having younger people participate in the process beyond adults is necessary for democracy. But at least among adults, according to Dahl, everyone needs to have this ability to participate. And again, to have that participation count the same. So if we think back to most of American history, this is one insight that Dahl is making that I think is very relevant and very important. we have to remember that this election system in which, any American adult which is not subject to some of the potential limits on voting that come from, certain things like felon disenfranchisement and other kinds of limits, right? Many American adults can vote now, including women, right? Including, members of underrepresented minorities, right? All of these different groups are able to participate in voting when at the foundation of American democracy, at the Constitutional Convention era, that was absolutely not the case. And so Dahl makes, I think, a number of very important points in his book about how American democracy itself could not really be called democratic for most of American history because it fails at least criteria number 1 and 2. And so even equality in voting, which I think the principle of one person, one vote, I think we at least try to take seriously in America. We'll talk in many respects about how that still might be violated today. Even these two criteria mean that we're not great at doing democracy, or at least we haven't been over the past, 200 years. A third criterion, this is one that I think a lot of students often really ponder deeply at the end of this exercise, is this question of whether or not people have the ability to gain enlightened understanding. And so if we go back to Dahl's definition of enlightened understanding, it's essentially, again, going back to the foundational definitions of power. This means that we know enough to be able to have, to exert an effect on who gets what, when, where, and how. And so really the inverse state is the one that we should think about. What would it mean to not have the enlightened understanding necessary to be able to have a political impact or to be able to shape power in your country? That would probably mean either you've got some kind of system where free access to information is closed off. So you can only learn what the ruling party tells you to learn, or you just don't have access to knowledge about the outside world. In many cases, you'll have restrictions on, the internet, that kind of thing, where it's just unlikely for you to be able to learn much about current conditions in the world or in your own country. But it goes beyond that, I think, this idea of enlightened understanding. To mean, right, that people also are able to, right, that have the means to be able to understand sort of the whole system, right? Whether or not we have the civics knowledge to be able to apply pressure in the right places, I'll never, forget, I am someone who is pretty active in local politics, micro local politics in my area, interacting with city council people and all kinds of stuff. And I'll never forget my city council person, came to a community meeting one time and was complaining, candidly to me after the meeting about these other sort of members of the community who were constantly getting mad at him about stuff that he had absolutely no jurisdiction to influence, right? Things that could be better handled at the state level or even the national level, right? And complaining constantly. They don't know that I'm the city council person. I can help you find out when your trash is going to get picked up, right? But I can't help you, redistrict, the state of Maryland, right? That's not how it works. And so if we don't have an equal access to the ability to understand these sort of basic civics pieces of knowledge, then maybe that too is a barrier to the ability to become an effective participant, right? Maybe number 3 actually has a lot to do with whether we're able to do number 1 and 2. So I really ponder this, and I think you should too, right? What does it mean to gain enlightened understanding? How does that happen in a society? Certainly part of that gets into fundamental questions about the role of education. It's interesting that in America we have this public schooling system, right? That is a taxpayer funded model. I mean, it's a really interesting thing, right? To think about the who gets what question that surrounds public education in America at the K-12 level. That's a very important set of political so whats, right? Public policy related to education. Moving along, I don't want to give 3 short shrift, right? This is important, right? But number 4 is maybe the one that's the most seemingly simple, but maybe the deepest one yet. The one that I think comes back again and again when we have discussions in Poly 100, and that is that the 4th criterion for democracy, according to Dahl, is having control over the agenda. Okay, and so the agenda, this is again a second order idea about who gets what, when, and how. Because if we think about a policy debate, right? Let's say somebody's like, oh, we want, we want every American to get a puppy, right? Every American gets a puppy, and then on the other side of the debate, somebody's saying, it would be impractical to give every American a puppy. Some Americans don't want puppies. This policy would bankrupt the country, right? We would have to have, millions of puppy breeders, set up to do this, right? It would be too expensive. The public policy of should we demand everyone gets a puppy or not is a public policy debate about who gets what. But whether or not that issue is debated in the first place is itself also a political question, right? So the question of, is that policy on the table or not? Is this something that we focus our attention on or not? And so the puppy example is really flippant and stupid, but when we think about other examples of public policies, other kinds of laws, other kinds of ideas that are important, right? We think about things like healthcare, right? Healthcare reform. Is that something that Congress debates, or is it something that they leave off the table? Right? We think about, for example, some of the landmark Supreme Court cases related to same-sex marriage at the national level, right? Obergefell versus Hodges, others of these, landmark court cases establishing sort of a legal precedent for same-sex marriage across the states, right? Is that something the Supreme Court decides to take these cases where they address this stuff head on, or do they pass on it, right? Do they let the status quo essentially be the conventional political outcome? This is agenda setting, right? The control over the agenda is, do we as the public have the ability to say, hey, here's an issue, and we all agree that it's really important. We want to elevate that to the level of political discussion. Can we do that or not? And so you might think, like in an authoritarian country, like if we think about the purely like the least democratic kinds of examples, absolutely not, right? The public is going to have very little control over the agenda. Because if that country is being captured by a single political elite, that means that the agenda is going to be entirely what that elite wants to talk about. And so you're very rarely, unless there's some kind of massive protest action or something, right, pushing along this new issue, right? You might really, really, really care about this specific thing, and it's just not ever going to become a political topic. And so if you think about it, right, agenda control is super powerful. It's a really, really important way to affect who gets what, when, and how, because there might be some countries where they say, look, we poll the public, we ask people what they think, right? We try to do as much as possible every single thing that the public wants, except for this issue. We don't talk about it. We don't touch it, right? And that issue might be the most important issue, according to a lot of people, but they won't touch it because, again, that's something where the prevailing political elite in a closed-off, non-democratic country, that's where they have their sorts of power. And so, something like even like electoral reform, if people say, oh, we don't want to touch that, that is itself an agenda control question. And so, when it comes down to reforming institutions, when it comes down to, certain kinds of who gets what questions that are left off the agenda entirely, that's where we have to ask ourselves really critically, what's going on here? How is this power dynamic playing out? It's a really, really, really important phenomenon, and one that's going to come up. We're going to see many more examples of agenda control as we go throughout the semester. And then finally, I think Dahl's last criterion for democratic polities is a pretty simple one. It's essentially inclusion of all adults, as we said, right? Equality in voting, one person, one vote, but we also have this idea that everybody has the ability to be included in the political process so they're not shut out from politics. And so, I'll simply leave this last one for you with a question. Do you think that American politics succeeds ultimately at this definition, number 5, if we have full inclusion in the politics of all adults or not? And that I think is, again, something to ponder in light of the fact that Dahl poses these other 4 as really important criteria. So these are the 5 criteria for democracy that Dahl talk about. I really, really encourage you to try to spot where these criteria fit in to the rest of our content. As you're reading about the structure of government, as you're reading about some of the basics over the next couple of weeks, think back to this stuff. And of course, nowhere else is this more important than in our Genovian simulation, because at the end of the day, we're going to be creating a constitution that's going to potentially serve the citizens of Genovia, or it's going to end in disaster. We'll see what happens. But at the end of the day, we need to evaluate that constitution on the basis of these 5 criteria and see whether or not we're able to create something that, even remotely resembles what Dahl might call a democracy. So until next time, I leave you to ponder these 5 very important political principles. So long.